welcome to another episode of Exceptional Advice. So I'm Baz Gardner, and this is...
I'm Tristan Howard.
So today we're going to talk about getting the most out of your team when it comes to running an advice practice, whatever your denomination is, and some of the more common challenges that we've seen and experienced. So Tristan, just for some context, has worked with me now for 4.5 years. Starting out, kind of doing all kinds of different things, sitting in a lot of client meetings, being what I would call an associate or assistant advisor, and in more recent times moving up to, actually advising clients and working with them directly. So not only are we going to get the chance to cover some of the key issues that we encounter with our clients all the time and the things that we see in advice firms, but also the stuff that, we've experienced directly ourselves. And I guess for me, I've run different kinds of advice firms now for 25 years. Actually, that makes me feel pretty old. So 25 years. So over that time, I've employed and worked with lots of different team members. So, learning some of the journey myself. But I'm also going to self-reflect a little bit because, hey, let's face it, I'm also been a member of those teams and thinking about how I've developed myself, and if in the early days when I was an employee, what things might have actually helped me to grow to the fore, quicker, better, etc. So what should we talk about first?
So I'm thinking we start with maybe going over communications.
Okay.
So just kind of general comms with team members, and then we can go from there.
All right. So this show is really about sharing all the things that we've learnt through running our own advice firms and working with, hundreds of others. So at the core of it, everything is about communication, isn't it? And I think this is one of the critical elements of what makes exceptional advice, because in order to give exceptional advice, in order to have the greatest impact for your clients, deliver an amazing experience for them, change their lives, have the most value, you also have to create an amazing advice team. Unless you're doing everything yourself, and there's not too many advisors that I've encountered that want to do everything themselves. So that's not generally the reason that you go into business. And to be honest, I think that is incredibly difficult to do, because not all tasks within what you have to do as an advisor are created equal. So if you're an accountant, obviously there's number crunching, there's software, there's back end stuff to do your compliance work for your clients, and then there's the actual advice bit. So I think one of the things that we might start talking about as a side note from communication is understanding the different responsibilities and tasks within a business, but understanding who's good at what.
Yep.
Right? So this has been a major area, not only in my own businesses, but in all of the businesses that I've worked with, is a misunderstanding of allocation of responsibilities. So, if you're starting out as an advisor, so some of our listeners, viewers, I'm sure, are at the point where they're contemplating going into business for themselves, or they have more recently. So maybe to begin with, it's just you, right? So at that point in time, what tasks do you have to do in your advice firm?
You got everything.
Yeah, absolutely everything. But does that mean you're going to be good at paperwork?
Oh,
right?
no way.
Now, I guess on the flip side to this is understanding that just because, and we've encountered this as an issue many times, so I'm not an all-rounder, so I just want to be clear on that. I'm certainly far more extreme in my character sets. That's one of the reasons why I don't do meetings on my own. I have a team of people that help me with those things. They sit in, they take notes, they help me with a follow-up. Why? Because the linear process component is not is not how my brain functions. I want to see the task completed. I want to make sure they're done. That's why I build businesses around me. It's why I come up with process. That doesn't mean I'm good at doing it. So there's definitely, if we're talking communication, I think the key thing that I wanted to bring out here is the honesty required. And we're going to use a couple of examples of this, that we've experienced, personally, but also with clients that we've worked with. So for me, I go back to when I started out, as an advisor in 1996. I was very green, very young. I just finished, I'm not sure if I'd finished my postgrad, but I'd certainly finished my undergrad. Was working in a broking firm that was moving into what they called more holistic advice. It was still back in the product days of financial advice. So holistic to them meant not just the investments and the trades, but insurances and retirement vehicles and stuff like that as well. So that position was one where I was an employee, and sure, my remuneration was linked to a degree to how much business I produced, because that was the focus back then as well. But even then, whilst I was great at speaking to people, even at 22 years of age, I could go and find clients. That wasn't an obstacle for me. The obstacle was on everything else. So even then, one of the reasons I was able to succeed is because, I think there's two reasons. One, because I was honest with myself. I realized that if I was left to do any of the paperwork myself, I made mistakes. Right? I literally would make mistakes. Partially because I have some dyslexia. So that's how I kind of got into financials in the first place, because of spreadsheets. You could finally make maths make sense because everything would line up. So, a lot of the stuff we do these days is online, but back then it was, manual paperwork. So out of my own salary, I employed someone else who was really good at doing the paperwork. And because of that, I was able to do, 2 or 3 times the amount of business and client work. And even though, so number one, being honest about your capabilities, being explicit with the other people around you about what those capabilities are. So that's going to be a theme that we'll come back to and talk about a little bit in our show today. And the second component to that is thinking outside the box, right? So understanding that if you're an advice firm, getting the right people into the right positions is imperative. But there are always obstacles. So if I go back to when I started out back then, what were the obstacles? Well, I'm an employee. You don't employ other people out of your own salary. That's unheard of. Really? Well, I did. And it worked. And it was extremely successful. So there are always obstacles to these things. So I'm gonna come and use a couple of more recent examples of working with clients that are pretty common stuff, and hopefully will give you some things to think through as far as, are you getting the most out of your team by making sure that you've been honest enough about what the key strengths of each player is. Okay, so we're working at the moment with an accounting and financial services firm. So it's got both divisions, if you want to call it that. It's certainly larger on the accounting firm side. So we've got more partners, more directors on the accounting firm than on the wealth side, which is not an untypical scenario in my experience for those that have kind of bridged the gap between the two. So when we've gone through and we've done an analysis of all of the different players in the advice groups. So I'm going to focus on the accounting firm for this particular discussion. Part of the problem here is that there's an expectation that all parties are all parties. So if you think about, well, what does an advisor do? What are the tasks that have to happen for an engagement between an advisor and their clients? It doesn't matter what your denomination is. So So Tristan, what do you think? What are the things that you have to be able to do, or that have to take place?
Well, you've got a couple things. So you've got to meet with someone. You've got to make sure that you really understand what they're after, what their situation is, and how best to help them.
Okay, so the key bit, the advice bit, right?
Yep.
So you've got to. So I like the way you're thinking there. You've got to build trust, right? So you've got to create the trust, the connection, understand what they actually want, and I think this is critically important. The better you are at defining what they actually want to do in their life in their emotional context, the better you can be as an advisor, because you can tie everything back to that. I think that's a fundamental area that advisors should always be looking to get better at. So what else? What else has to happen? There's got to be, you've got to book meetings, right? So if you're meeting with clients,
got to get information. So you probably
Yep.
got to fill out a few forms.
so there's follow-up work,
Yep.
there's data collection, there's reviewing information.
Yep, double checking everything you've already done.
Yep. So what about in the giving the advice? So there's usually two elements to that, isn't there? You've got the bit where you're actually translating it to a client,
Mm-hmm.
but how many advisors don't give anything else? Right, that's it. We just sit down. Here's my advice. That's it. Nothing else. Not many, right?
Not many at all.
So if you're an accountant, then what else comes with your advice? Well, there's contracts. There's the compliance work itself. Profit and loss statements. There's the reporting back to various revenue services, tax offices, whatever, depending on your jurisdiction. So there's all of these elements that need to take place. So there's advice, there's administrative, there's operational, coordination, there's mechanical and technical. Yeah, makes sense?
Yep.
So one of the biggest challenges or problems that I see in creating exceptional advice firms where we're really, really hitting our stride is the misunderstanding between all of these different areas. Okay, so we've built algorithms and scorecards for figuring out mechanical aspects of this. So, one of the ways that we've done it, we've created 4 different categories for advisor characteristics. Okay, so the 4 categories are Rainmaker, right? And again, you will have heard these concepts many times, and they've been expressed in different ways. So we're just using them as a tool to give you an idea of the correlation, because everyone will have different capabilities in each of these different areas and combinations. So you've got Rainmaker, or interventional conversationalist is another component within Rainmaker. So interventional conversationalist, what does that mean? You're able to actually have a challenging conversation with a client. You can put a fee to them. You can deal with the more uncomfortable components of what's required in exceptional advice. Okay? So that is absolutely necessary for one major function in advice, and that is selling the advice itself. So typically, if you're a founder of a business and you've grown the business, then you're going to have a very high correlation with, the Rainmaker category. So we then have what we call a cultivator. These are kind of the all-rounders, but still have the ability to have interventional conversations. We have nurturers, who are really, really good at closing loops and being, completing things and doing the tasks that they say they're going to do, except if that task involves confrontation, okay, or challenging conversation. Now, what I'd like you to understand in this concept is, it's not just, there's kind of 2 elements. You think about the nature nurture and parenting, and this really applies to similar situations here. So you've got nature. I've always been good at having challenging conversations with people. Now, that doesn't mean I was exceptional in all areas. I've learnt to be more direct in my personal relationships, and certainly had a tendency to avoid conflict in those, and sometimes I still get myself in trouble by doing it. But with clients, I was always able to take the chance. Let's call this person. You know what? I think they'd be really interesting to talk to. Who cares if they're a CEO of a listed company? I'm going to cold call them and talk to them. By the same token, on the flip side, as I was talking before, as an extreme rainmaker or interventional conversationalist, I'm incredibly weak or have a low correlation with things like nurturer or mechanic. Okay? So let's explore these concepts a little more. If you don't have the ability to have those interventional conversations, or the degree to which you do, typically, and this comes back to the idea that we always talk about, the loop opener and loop closer. So do you just want to share with people, because I talk about this all the time, I'd like to hear it from you. Mm-hmm. How would you describe a loop opener versus a loop closer, Tristan?
So I think the key difference is kind of the drivers. So you've got someone who wants to, if you're a loop opener, you've got someone who really wants to create new things, evolve things into the next iteration, whatever that may be, and then figure out how it needs to be done. But that's kind of where their super efficient speciality ends, because after that it's very task driven. You break it down and then you have to do bit by bit and go through and do tasks. And loop closers really kick in there, because once you start doing those tasks, you get closer and closer to the completed picture and having all the loops closed.
Okay, so I'm going to have a crack at adding some context to this. These are really important concepts, and certainly in my obsessive quest to figure out how to create exceptional advice, this has been such a major component to my own quest towards mastery. People who are loop openers are driven by conceptual solutions generally, okay? They're driven by starting working on problems. So I'll give you an example. If I've got a scenario, I love it when someone throws me a difficult problem. And once I solve it conceptually and I've given them the aha moments through that, my brain loses, I won't say interest, although that's an element to it. It loses some focus. Okay, so people who are loop openers see the bigger picture, all of the elements at once, but are very challenged. The more extreme they are in that regards, they're more challenged when it comes to narrowing down the linear pathway and sticking to the definitive next steps. They're also not driven by the completion of the task. Okay, so if you think about creatively solving problems, which is at the core of exceptional advice, then you have to do the conceptual component. You have to navigate the pathway, have the conversation with a client, negotiate an outcome, find a way to get them to engage with the solution that's going to get them to where they actually want to be. But then you actually have to do steps to make sure that takes place. And depending on whichever advice denomination you are, those steps will be slightly different, but there's commonalities across all of them. If you're a loop closer, and I'll give an example here. So we've been helping some of our clients more recently in the recruiting of team members, and there's two particular team members that make a massive difference to any advice firm. One is the person who runs the operational side of things, okay? And if you have an advice firm and you don't have someone that is running the ops side, then you're very limited in how far you can take this business. And they need to have a certain set of characteristics. One of those sets of characteristics is the being driven by task completion. So we're interviewing at the moment, and as in terms of helping our client build out this team, and all three of the prospective people to fill this role, right, all said variations of this same thing. And I asked the question, okay, so do you write lists in your life? Do you use the list? Yes, I love lists. What happens if you have a task that you complete that wasn't on your list. Do you feel as good? No. In fact, I write it on the list so I can tick it off. So this is a really extreme variation of the opposite side that, in this equation, which is the loop closing. And I'll talk about this concept I'm sure, throughout many episodes of the podcast because it just affects so many things. So if we're talking about getting the best out of your team, understanding where they fit in this ecosystem, both from a personality as well as a capability. Okay? So the nature versus nurture. A lot of these things are hardwired. So if you take someone who is a nurturer that is primarily driven by worrying about what other people think of them, that has a stronger drive for loop closing rather than loop opening, and then that doesn't mean they're a bad advisor, but you shouldn't be putting them in a role where you expect them to go out and generate a whole lot of new business. Okay. On the flip side, and we'll come back to this accounting firm. So there's 4 key partners. There's more partners than this in the business, but four key partners that we've been focused on in terms of how do we kickstart growth. Really, really strong business, been around for a long time, but not growing significantly at this point in time. So let's take a look at where this growth is going to come from. And we just did a recent episode about you don't need more clients to grow your business. And here's going a little bit deeper into some of the elements that play into this, like getting the most out of your team. And one of the partners is what I would call an extreme loop opener. Okay, so someone that's really driven by that. And because of that, the correlation with mechanic, nurturer, and the ability to complete tasks incredibly low, like even more extreme than myself. The problem is, however, that the partners have set up an ecosystem and a team where everyone's expected to operate in the same way. So in other words, he's not getting his reporting done for productivity. Billing isn't processed on time. He's got 4,000 emails in his inbox, right? And he's feeling burnt out and just thinking about retiring, right? Yeah, he's lost his mojo. So you've got the person, so think about this. You've got a business that isn't growing, right? You've got a person that is an extreme rainmaker who's in a conflicted state because he's expected to perform like one of the other partners who is an extreme all-rounder. So he's always got his reporting done in time. His billings are always up to date. The inbox is always down to 20. But he's nowhere near as strong on being able to go out and find clients and make it rain and have the interventional conversations. So, does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right? Let me ask it this way then. Does it make sense that you would put both of those people in the same situation and give both of them the same resourcing?
No.
So just because one partner doesn't need an assistant to sit in on meetings and a person like an executive assistant to coordinate their time and emails and to do all of those tasks, just because one or the other 4 partners, and especially the 3 that we're looking at, don't need that, doesn't mean that he doesn't. Not only that, he's managing and servicing a really large client base, right? So frustrating the managers that sit underneath him because he's expected to do tasks like everyone else when he's just not capable of doing those things. But it's a misunderstanding of capability. So simply by re-engineering this and having one of the junior partners coming in to be in on all of the new client stuff that we're doing, by empowering the managers underneath to step up to manage more of the relationship aspects, by giving him, a personal assistant, we're now bringing clients in like crazy, right? I mean, he's like me. Okay, now go find a client. You're free. Oh, he picks up the phone. What do you know? You know, the biggest client in the firm, and that was from one phone call. So my point out of all of this is, when you're looking at your team, you really need to understand not just what the roles are, not just what the tasks are, but what are they capable of doing and where do they fit? What's their nature and where can you nurture them? Because on the flip side to this, right, you might have someone who's a great servicing advisor, but you want them to be able to reposition pricing with clients, right? So that's not going to be their natural strong suit or capability.
Yep.
By the same token, with training and creating better process and support, just because it didn't come naturally doesn't mean you can't empower them to be much better at it. Okay? But by the same token, you can't take a round peg and train it to fit into the square hole.
Yep.
Right? That's not going to work. So, as you know, Tristan, I'm a big fan of multi-advisor businesses. So I think partnerships can really come into their power when there's explicit honesty about stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So when we were talking about, doing this show and what was the key concept we were thinking about, in fact, it was your idea. It's the being explicit, right?
Yeah.
So if we're going to boil all of this down, being explicit, what do we mean by this concept? This is going to be another one that we bring up throughout lots of our different episodes and interviews that we've got coming up as well. Being explicit is really about taking what's subconscious. So, for example, that particular partner, he always knew that he wasn't very good at doing these things, right? He always knew that it just wasn't a thing, but he'd never really admitted to himself that that was okay. He'd never admitted to himself that he wasn't capable of doing it. The other partners hadn't admitted it. The other partners hadn't gone, well, hang on a second, he's really good at this stuff, so why are we expecting him to do the other? So there wasn't enough honesty. It was implied, everyone knew it, so in us going through and having all of these conversations to work out where these bottlenecks are and to resolve them, everyone knew it, but there was conflict about it, right? The managers are frustrated because, the ones that work for him don't get stuff through in the same way, etc. When instead he should be celebrated because he's one of the best advisors, I've come across. His ability to engage clients and to have an interventional conversation with them and to really get them to the heart of the problem and come up with solutions it's exceptional. Like it really, really is. But he's not being an exceptional advisor, even though he's already at that level, because there's not enough honesty in the team around him and the ecosystem. Okay? So you have to know what your capabilities are, but there's also a recognition of strengths. And so often within firms, I see the person who has the strongest rainmaking capability running the business, spending way too much time on operational issues, trying to service clients for the more mechanical process-driven components, spending too much time on the technical aspects of the advice, but which bit actually creates the revenue and the value chain the most? It's the loop opening, the rainmaking, right? So often I see this as being one of the major sticking points. And then conversely, this is how so many advisors I see try to solve this. Who do they try to recruit? Well, it's not who they try to recruit, but what do they try to recruit the next layer of advisor to do? So I'm stuck, I can't service any more clients. I don't have enough time. Maybe I've managed to pull off doing a good job. My reputation's growing. So, but I can't service any more clients. So typically the idea for, most coaches, consultants, financial advisors, accountants, even in the legal fraternity, let's go out and recruit someone to be an all-rounder like we had to be. Okay? So we expect them to do the work. We expect them to serve the clients. We expect them to nurture them, to be process-driven, to take care of all the dirty work that we, might not want to do anymore. But we also expect them to grow to get clients.
Yeah.
And the problem with that is that if you've got someone who's an all-rounder, that's great, and they can make good servicing advice, but will they ever be as good as a rainmaker at growing the business?
Definitely not naturally, not without a whole lot of effort and training, and maybe even not.
Well,
even
even
that.
so,
Yeah,
like I said, they can certainly get better at it.
Yeah.
Like everyone can improve on their weak points, but which are you going to get the biggest return out of? I think this is a key concept.
Yeah.
You're going to get the biggest return out of polishing your weaknesses or enhancing your strengths.
Definitely enhancing your strengths.
Yeah,
It's almost like there's a multiplier on it.
Oh, absolutely. You're spot on. We're talking, degrees versus multiplication. So degrees of improvement versus a multiplication effect. And, I hear Gary Vaynerchuk, talk about this stuff all the time. Double down on your strengths. And it, especially when you're thinking about building the best teams and getting the most out of your team, it's absolutely critical. So you have to know who you're recruiting for. You have to know what kind of person you've got there. And often you can make the biggest mistakes by recruiting for the wrong thing. For example, I need to replicate myself. I can't do any more. So I'm going to bring someone in who, I can hire to be a coach for me, and they can get clients and service the ones, and maybe work for the clients that aren't quite at the level that I want to be at. You get the idea, right?
Yep.
The problem with that is it's not the best allocation of resources, okay? And just because you had excess capacity and were capable of juggling all of that stuff doesn't mean that's going to make a good employee. So, funnily enough, largely and most of the time, you're going to be better off hiring someone who is not as interventional as you, not as much of a rainmaker. And I talk about this a lot. Should the advisors that work for you be given revenue targets? Well, it depends how good a rainmaker you are. So if you're bringing them underneath you, or one of the other partners or directors in the business, if they're kind of coming in to help replicate what you're creating, then typically that means you're good at doing that. So you're probably better off finding someone who's awesome at servicing the hell out of clients and let them service more of what you're doing so you can be free to actually use your strengths. On the flip side, there's risk in recruiting rainmakers. There's no doubt about that whatsoever. So where does the value chain start? It's at getting a client, right?
Yeah, the front end, like the very first interaction.
Yeah, so for value to start, you have to have clients. You have to get them, onboard them, convince them to take your advice, to pay you money.
Mm-hmm.
So it's typically why, and there's other ways to do this, but typically why most of the people who found advice firms are not mechanics. It's not an 80% correlation with mechanic, it's an 80% correlation with being a rainmaker. Much smaller correlation with, nurturer, mechanic, and cultivator. Or in other words, they're loop openers, not loop closers. Yep. And typically that's going to determine how quickly the business builds. So if you've got someone who's, more of a cultivator, so sure, they can get clients and, they have to really work centers of influence. They can't just pick up the phone and have a chat to someone and ask the questions and get them on board. their businesses will grow slower. They'll look for more, as I said, centers of influence, referral partners, or they can buy a book of business. By the same token, very rarely have I seen it be successful where, a mechanic or nurturer goes into business for themselves because they don't break that front ground. So then what's the risk if you are a strong rainmaker, right, and you go and you're trying to replicate and scale and grow your advice firm, and I think I come in at an our scale that we use an 83% correlation with rainmaker, which is really high. And I think Jeff, who I was talking about, something like 85, so even higher. So what's the risk of then going and recruiting someone with that same correlation?
With the rainmaker correlation?
Yeah.
You've got too much of the same thing? It kind of it amplifies it.
Yeah, how much of it do you need within a business?
Yeah.
So in my own financial planning firm, for the 15 years that I ran that, I think that's one of the reasons why, don't get me wrong, I certainly made a lot of mistakes. But one of the reasons why I was able to grow it, and also one of the reasons why there was periods of stagnation, is that me getting stuck, not being the rainmaker and interventional conversationalist.
Yep.
And then the periods of growth were then I freed myself to be able to do those things. So, at one point in time, we had 7 advisors in the business. None of them had an extreme correlation with rainmaking. All of them were expected to be able to onboard clients, but they could use me to help them with all of that. So in other words, I became the rainmaker for 7 other advisors. Okay. So what happens if you recruit 2? But I'm bogged down in, doing all kinds of other stuff. It's not the best allocation of resources. The other thing about it is if you're recruiting someone else to be a rainmaker, then they're going to want to run the show.
Yep.
That's one of the characteristics, right? You're the bulldozer. You want to be out the front. And that's okay if you're looking for a business partner, but you don't necessarily, and this is the other thing with firms, in order to, replicate what they've done, they bring someone in, and when they've got someone who can, do all of those things, then they make them a partner. Well, you don't have to run it that way. You can corporatize a business if you understand how to divide up the responsibilities for tasks and build a team that does it rather than silos. So in other words, it can be more like a pyramid rather than, the pyramid being too steep and then it has to replicate into other pyramids. Hopefully that analogy worked because I just came up with it on the spot. So being explicit about capabilities is kind of the summary of that conversation so far.
Yep.
So what's changed? If we talk about the clients we're working with at the moment, they're just front of mind. So what's changing? Well, we've had the conversation, talking to the other partners. Hey guys, why are you getting frustrated with this guy? And talking to him and saying, why are you getting frustrated and defending yourself? Right? We've got to be honest here. Let's celebrate what you're good at. Let's free you up. So there had to be an admission and taking things that were implied, like, I didn't tell people anything they didn't already know. They already knew he wasn't good at this stuff. They already knew that he didn't close loops well enough. They already knew he was great on the client engagement side. But no one had explicitly sat down and gone, hang on a second, that's his strengths, this is his weaknesses. Let's actually build a plan instead of sticking into a box where he's supposed to do it the same way as everyone else. So I'm gonna take this chance to switch from that being, the center of example for how this can play out, and I want to move into someone who is an all-rounder, right? And the problems that creates. So if you are, and kind of the cultivator in our category sections that we particularly use, right? They are very good all rounders, but on the end of being able to be on the sales side. I know sales is a dirty word when it comes to advice, but you have to sell yourself. You have to sell the solutions for what the clients actually want, right? You have to get them to take action. Otherwise, your advice is irrelevant. So authentic selling is essential as an advisor. It's essential in building exceptional advice. So you've got someone who's a good all-rounder. They can engage clients, they can find business, they can sell. They're not as extremely gifted as someone who is a pure rainmaker. By the same token, they can also complete tasks. They're process driven at the same time. So what do you think the challenge is there if you are an all-rounder?
If you are an all-rounder, sometimes you can get stuck doing almost like put into the box of being good at doing tasks. And then you kind of get bogged down because there's so much, and the more you do of it, the more you free up a rainmaker, which is a good thing. But if you're not purely, on more the mechanic correlation side of things, you're going to be missing a whole bit that you need. You need that client interaction. You need to be at the front. You need to be doing at least some of that and playing to your strength there.
Right. Okay. So if I were to take what you said and maybe give it a reframing for some extra context, is what you're saying, because you're an all-rounder, you are an all-rounder, and then you end up doing things that you shouldn't.
Yeah, it's almost like flavor of the week. Oh, we're behind here, so I'm just going to get completely stuck into this.
So you end up doing tasks that need doing because you can.
Yep.
Instead of delegating.
Mm-hmm.
So all-rounders can cause just as much problems for themselves as the specialists on, being a rainmaker. By the way, there's also the other end of the specialist spectrum, which is being the mechanic. So really good on the technical process side, not so good on the client engagement. The mechanics typically, at least early in their careers, until they learn that ignoring the human elements is inefficient, right? I know you can relate to some of these things. So mechanics can get frustrated by the human elements. Why can't people just understand this? It's straightforward. It's process driven. What do you mean? What do you mean this upset them? I just gave them the 3-word answer that told them exactly what to do. So until they work out that the human engagement, bedside manner, and all the rest of it is actually how you create efficiency, not by ignoring it. So anyway, painting the scene, we've got some extremes here, so I won't get bogged down on the mechanics at this point. All-rounders. So mostly this show is aimed at people running advice firms, okay? Or those in the operational roles that kind of have to figure out how it all works. So the two profiles that almost always are the principals of advice firms is a rainmaker or a cultivator. So in other words, a loop opener or an all-rounder. The all-rounders will typically maybe have bought books of business or, found other ways to get clients in the first place. Maybe they've come in and taken over from, a previous generation of advisor. Maybe they've worked their way up to being a partner within a firm because they can be an all-rounder, including growing the business, but not going out and, like I said, just if I get 5 minutes to walk the street, I'll spot a business owner, and before you know it, I'm talking to them, they're a client, right? So the problem with being an all-rounder is that you end up being an all-rounder. And so you cap out your capability because you haven't been honest with yourself that you are good at doing all things, which can quite often make you bad at being a delegator. And so remember, where is exceptional advice actually created? It's created at the client engagement side. So figuring out how to get people with the strongest capabilities in those regard to be doing that almost all of the time is essential.
So I'm not sure if you want to keep going on that. I did have a couple questions that kind of dig into a bit of the nuance.
Mm-hmm.
But you you can judge. So one thing I was curious about was we talked a lot about, being explicit and being upfront. Is Do you think there's any place internally for kind of being implicit on purpose? Like, is there any situations you can think of where that's actually important?
Yeah, it's kind of interesting, and I know you're prodding me here because we've had this conversation before, right? So, if I were to round out what we've talked about so far, there's the element of being explicit in who's good at what, and actually overcoming the obstacles to free those people up to do the things they're good at. Stop trying to put everyone into the same bucket, so to speak. So then there's the next bit, which is developing your team members, right? And if we're talking about the idea of getting the most out of your team, then how do you grow them, right? What are the frustrations that business owners have so much of the time when building their teams? And I think we need to talk a little bit about that before I can come back to what you're asking me about, which is sometimes you may not want to be as explicit to challenge your team, to get them to think for themselves, right? So let's kind of talk about some of the frustrations. I've experienced them. Almost anyone running an advice firm, anyone that I've dug into, the thousands of meetings I've had with fellow advisors and business owners, these are all very, very common characteristics. So you're in the position where you engage with a client, right? If something's not done right, who wears that?
The person doing the engagement, whoever's talking to the client.
Right. So if you're an advisor, then you're in that role. And if you're a business owner, then or a director, or you're leading your silo, whatever, then the ultimate responsibility for that client's side stops with you. So in other words, if the work hasn't been thought through clearly, if there's an error in a statement of advice, an advice document, or a profit and loss statement, or whatever it is, a report, strategy plan, if there's mistakes, or if there's just not bedside manner in it, if it just hasn't been considered from a point of view of how the client will engage with it, and it actually gets delivered to a client, then who has to wear it? You do. So some of the biggest frustrations that I experience when you're working with a support team is that they rely on you to be the backdrop. You're the fallback for supervising their work. So why is that? Why do you think team members who don't have the ultimate responsibility at the end often kind of leave the final polishing points, or let the errors get through to the advisor who's going to deliver it? Why do you think that takes place, Tristan?
Well, I think you kind of said it already. They're not the ones that are at the end of it when things go wrong. They're not actually facing the consequences of messing something up. They're not in the meeting, or they're not presenting it to the client, or they're not there themselves.
Right. So then there's this challenge where you're starting out with someone, let's say you're bringing them into your team, right? So they're brand new. Maybe they're young in their career and you're trying to develop them. It could be doesn't matter whether their role's operational or advisor related. Mm-hmm. And so when they first get there, do they know exactly what tasks they need to do to complete something?
No, probably not.
So what you're going to give them in terms of what they should do would be very task-driven, yeah?
Yep, for sure.
So let's say they get good at doing exactly the tasks that you're given.
Yep.
That part of the process, so long as you've got, an employee who's, at least got themselves together, that part of the process generally doesn't bring a huge amount of frustration for their employer, for their advisor, for the person supervising them, however you want to call it. Because they're completing tasks and you're giving them tasks to do. Where the frustration comes is when, in your mind, they now should be able to think for themselves.
Mm.
So you started them out by giving them tasks. Now they're doing the tasks, but they're not really seeing through to what the objective of the task is.
Mm. Yeah.
So maybe they're ticking it off the list. So when you brought them in, it's about task completion. Do this, follow this, do it this way. Here's the pro forma. Here's the engagement letter. Here's the invoice template. Here's the calculation. Here's the spreadsheet, whatever, right? Do this, do that, do this. And okay, maybe along that journey, you've explained to them why the task is done that way. I mean, obviously that's good training.
Mm-hmm.
If someone understands the reason why, then they're going to get better at actually completing the task accurately.
Yeah, they get the full picture.
Yeah. But that's not the bit where we're going. We're going to the bit where it's like, well, actually this was a slightly different scenario. Why didn't, can't you think through that? I mean, you've been doing this for ages. You've got all the technical training. You finish your degrees now. We've talked about this a million times. Yet you didn't do that. You just tick the box. So you're bringing them through. You're getting them to focus on tasks and completion. And their sense of value then comes from, and I'm not saying in all cases, we're making some generalizations here, right? This is a common problem.
Yeah.
Especially, when you've got someone who is certainly not a rainmaker. There's other problems if you're employing one of those like we talked about before. So their sense of self-worth and their position of value is now on processing tasks. It's not necessarily on what the task achieves. It's not on how the task interrelates with the client. It may be to a degree on how the task interrelates with you or other people delivering the advice, but only to a degree. So in other words, you've been explicit about what they need to do, and the end value of that is hit a wall. So being explicit about the task isn't going to get them any further. You can sit down to them and explain 1,000 times, don't do it this way, follow it this way, etc. But what you're not giving them is that next step into the objective. Okay, and that's where I think the next transition kind of comes into play. So, you and I have had this conversation personally, right?
Yeah.
So, after 4.5 years, just in the last few months, I've kind of sat down and said, okay, well, you've mastered the task completion, right? I mean, you're brilliant. You're really, you understand how the mechanics work. You've sat in now on, thousands of meetings with clients.
Yeah.
We're allowing you to graduate from being my meeting assistant.
Throw my hat up.
Yeah. So you're progressing past that, right?
Yeah.
So the challenge for you then is, as I've said, don't rely on me, the stopgap, to think for you, right? Otherwise, your value's capped. Otherwise, your value's capped at what tasks you can complete instead of what objectives you can achieve. So what are some of the start measures, just if you're okay talking about that,
Yeah, of course.
that we've used to kind of get you moving into that next step and thinking outside of that? I'm completing the task. I've done what Baz wants me to do, but now I'm going to rely on him to take it and, rejig it for the client, rework it, whatever.
Yeah. So initially the first instance I remember at least, as you mentioned before, we've got like scorecards and algorithms and stuff. And I'd be crunching the numbers and doing the calculations, but I'd be leaving them as just that, as numbers, as calculations, just sitting on a spreadsheet. And then I'd hand it off to Baz because I'd done the calculations and I'd analyzed it, but I hadn't put it into a format that actually made sense to someone who did not understand the full process. So that was kind of the first thing we explored.
So I think this is really critical because until someone is connected to the objective, not from what you've said to them, not from being explicit and explaining it to them 1,000 times, but until they're actually connected to the objective and they experience it, you're not going to get them to go there. So one of the things that I said with Tristan, so we have what we call a launch plan, which is where almost all advice firms will have some kind of strategic initial engagement for projects. So we have a launch plan, and it's going through and doing a deep dive analysis of, the advisors within a business. A lot of the concepts we've talked about, we rate them on client engagement, referability, and we've built our own proprietary algorithms and mechanisms for doing this and identifying how to hone in on this stuff. And so at one point I said to Tristan, okay, well, it's now time to take the next step. So rather than me trying to explain to you why you need to put it in this format and how to do it, right, here's what's going to happen. This one, you're presenting to the client. I'm not going to check it. I'm going to be in the meeting and I'm going to help explain it. And if you completely mess it up, I'm going to be there to make sure that we rescue the client, but you'll have to own it. How was that fundamentally different for you?
Oh, well, you're going through the motion, you're actually dealing with the consequence. Because it's one thing for you to say, oh, we presented it this way last time, bit of confusion on, the titles of this or the numbers being this way. And it's like, oh, okay, I just change it for next time, cool, whatever, it's okay. But when you're actually presenting it, you're dealing with the work around yourself. So you're not just hearing this needs to happen for next time, slight change in the process. It's, this really needs to happen for next time because, we're losing 10 minutes explaining calculations instead of just presenting them as they are, them making sense, and then we can move on to everything making sense. Like you get the full picture a whole lot quicker when everything makes sense instead of you having to explain each individual bit and go along and kind of put the puzzle pieces together.
It's interesting because as an example, in all of the other launch plans that we've done, I'd still need to rework a lot of the stuff, right? Yeah. And so we'd got to the end of me saying, hey, look, I've explained this to you. Why didn't you think through this? But it's funny, when you actually did it, sure, there was some tweaks we made.
Yeah.
But not much.
No, not many.
So part of what happened is you now become attached to the objective.
Yeah.
So if you want to develop your team members that are back office or even... So back office, what I mean by that? Well, let's say mechanic. So we'll talk financial planning. We've used a few different denominational examples here. So as a financial advisor, you have paraplanners. So they're the people that do the number crunching, write the advice documents, etc. So if you've got an internal paraplanner, a lot of people are outsourcing them now, but even so, you'll generally have someone in your team coordinating that. In my financial planning business, one of the ways that I did that was so that maybe they don't have an authority to give the advice, so I can't have them presenting it. That doesn't mean I can't make them call the client and explain the mistake. Now, I'm going to give you this little tip as the advisor. If you have a good relationship with your client and you're explicit with them, so we'll talk about being explicit with clients, just be honest with them. So in that particular scenario where Tristan was presenting, our launch plan, I just called the client. And I said, hey, I'm actually not going to present this to you. I'm going to be there. And maybe it'll take an extra meeting if I have to come back and circle around. But I'd like your help. I'm going to have Tristan present this to you. And here's why I'm doing it. You know what? I've done this hundreds of times. I've never had a client say, no, F off, I don't want to help you. Right? You're actually creating buy-in. You're making them a part of what you're doing. So I'd do the same thing. Sometimes I'd see, fundamental mistakes come through. So I'd let them go and I'd call the client. I'd say, look, I'm sending this out to you and here's the reason I'm doing it. And I'm doing it because I want them to actually experience it and I'm going to get them to call you. So there are certainly ways that you can make this happen and bring your team into experiencing the outcomes and connect to the objectives that are not going to cause you to lose clients. Right? And if you don't bridge that gap, it's going to take them so much longer and they may never ever get there. And this is a radical shift in being able to bring on team members and empower them. So make them responsible for the outcomes. You know, if you can get them to present the material, get them to do it. If they make mistakes, get them to call the client. Get them to own it, because it changes their psychology. It changes them from being focused on the task completion to being in a zone where they have to think through the outcomes and the objectives. And that's where we're talking about where being explicit loses its value. So once you've reached a point where you've been explicit enough, they've been task focused for a long period of time, they kind of should know and understand all of that, then you almost need to stop helping them with the task and instead make the tasks implied. I'm not going to tell you how to do it. You're going to deliver it. And if it's not good, you're going to wear the consequence. That's a major step up for teams. Okay? And so, I mean, we could literally talk for weeks about getting the most out of your team, but we've covered some pretty good angles today. Was there any other things that you felt we needed to kind of touch on?
No, not today. I've got a couple things for when we talk about being explicit with clients, but not for today.
Okay, so hopefully you've got some great value out of this. Please make sure that you've subscribed on our YouTube, that you've obviously subscribed through your favorite podcasting platform, and that you've engaged with us. Please make sure that you actually engage. We're trying to create content for you to help bring the conversation of exceptional advice forward. And in order for that to take place, we need your help. So long as we get your support, we're going to do more. We'll be willing to share more, use more examples, interview lots and lots of awesome people, and create more content for you. So we certainly appreciate you being a part of helping to reinvent the future of advice together and make it exceptional. So, and in my last summary, I'm going to say, be explicit, be honest about your capabilities, get the right people into the right roles, understand the psychology that gets in the way, find different ways to overcome it. And then when you want to really develop the value of your team, get them connected to the objective. Get them to actually experience the delivery of their service. Because not only will they be more accountable to it and understand how to think through it, they'll be forced to, but they also get the pleasure of actually seeing how what they do makes a difference to the end client. And that's what it's all about.